I just entered the London Tower on my tour. Well, it's not a tour, just a self-guided tour. One of the bee feeders, of which there are several hundred that live in the tower. I'll have to stop in a few moments and read the directions so I can go to the crown jewels, which Rick Steves suggests as the first thing to do, quickly and immediately. This is taken inside of the wall that you see when we go by on the bus. Other than to see it, I don't know the history of which came first, blah blah blah. This is looking the other way, standing outside the men's room, which appears to be free and available, which is unusual in London to find any public toilets that are close at hand, that don't cost money, that are nice and clean. That's a problem of big cities apparently, but also the penchant for Europeans to figure you don't need a toilet every minute. Obviously they're not over 65 years old. Only when I look at the crown jewels of England do I get a sense of justification, at least emotionally, in the French aftermath of the French Revolution, the carnage of the nobility. What small amount of gratification, as violent as it was, for the atrocity of their labor squandered to provide these people with unimaginable lifestyles. As much as I abhor violence, I can well understand the motivation of the French Revolution aftermath, and perhaps it was for the better. I recognize that just like the Germans of today have to get past the Nazis of yesteryear, here the British have gotten past the atrocity of their nobility by, number one, continuing the nobility but as figureheads, and thereby apparently justifying all of the pomp and circumstance and the artifacts of the history of that nobility when it had its absolute power. I'm going to go back through there again, see if I have a different reaction. I'm going to use this view as I pan all about at random as a backdrop for the comments on the second time through. Second time through, I spent more time looking at everything and trying to digest it. That's a very important thing to do. But some things that were interesting and ironical. The crown, for example, was so heavy for Elizabeth, I believe, that, and plus she had two scepters of some sort in her hands, that she was literally guided vertically into and out of her throne during the coronation because of the weight of everything. I think it was Elizabeth who opted to create a very small diamond crown and had the formal crown carried in front of her because it weighed so much. It's interesting when you listen to the coronation speeches, the incredible connection between God and religion on earth and the monarchy, obviously alluding to that claim of power. And speaking on the other hand with one of the beefeaters, he points out that as to the crowns and the scepters and so forth, most of them have been used since the restoration of the crown after the Civil War and the destruction of all of those artifacts, and that it's used time and time again, except in the rare instance when twofold. One, a king chooses to take advantage of his power and his ego. Even in today's world, George IV, I think, was the one who had a separate crown made for himself, but he was unable to convince the government to pay for the diamonds, so the crown now resides in some historical site without the diamonds. And the second is that when the king was the monarch who had the lineage to be so, the queen nevertheless had to accompany him to coronations and to the House of Commons, and so therefore she had to have her crown, and so therefore there are a series of crowns that were made for the Queen in that instance. Bottom line, that is the soul, part of the soul of the Englishman, in the same sense that probably our Constitution and perhaps some historical sites are the same of Americans, but without the pomp and circumstance trappings. This is White Tower. The entrance is to my left and around the building, I think. And there's the scaffold site and the Bloody Tower. And in the back, of course, the Tower Bridge Tower, one of the two. This is the Regimental Mess and Museum. It's in this building that the crown jewels are stored. Don't know what's on the second floor, or probably what's in other parts of the building. This highly decorative cannon weighs 5.5 tons. Was developed or made for the Duke of Wellington in 1827. Whether it was ever used or not, I don't know. This is St. John's Chapel inside of the White Tower. In the early years, these alternating blocks of stone would have been painted red. When in a chapel like this, where the king and queen may have lived, in the next rooms perhaps, you wonder what a king said to a god, or asked of a god, that he supposedly had such a close connection to. Probably the same thing that all of us ask for, if we're religious. I'm not. And that is help in achieving goals and help in preventing disasters on yourself. It said the tower was not only a residence for the royalty, but an armory, a zoo, and a few other things, perhaps over time. The upper picture indicates how the chamber might have looked in 1120. And the lower one represents how it was in 1490 when the overhead floor was inserted. It's one of 4 fireplaces. It predates the introduction of the chimney stack, when smoke was allowed to escape through 2 holes. Here, it allowed the hearth to be farther out into the room and consequently generate more heat. As you can imagine, in cold winter days, early in the morning when the fire had been cranked up, I'm sure they kept them going all night long for the king and queen or whatever. But one can imagine that cooking away and the heat pouring out, people focused around it. This is the Norman garderobe. In other words, bathroom. And this indicates how effluent was expelled out into the dead zones outside the wall. Imagine the great personages who walked this same path and sat on that toilet. There you can see out. What a form of torture that would be, to tie somebody to the wall outside. Gross, but I'm sure it was thought of before I did. Probably within these very walls. This is the tower in 1547. We're in still another room, a little bit larger than the last one, which after the 1600s became the armory for the royals. I wonder what that little protrusion on the right breast is. And look at some of the damage that's occurred. This is armor for a boy, which is why it's so small. What's a boy doing in the military? Probably to get the royalty and initiated into their duties of greater age. Royal horse armor. I wonder how often they sent a substitute out, because it could not be disclosed that it was a substitute. Again, I wonder what that little device is, what its purpose was. Perhaps to hold the lance or something like that, or coffee. Early versions of guns. These were breech-loading guns. Apparently an original lance. I'll have to go read what the instructions say, but it looks like it'd be a giant, heavy thing, particularly this part down here. You had to be tough to ride around with that armor and carry one of these puppies. And this is hollow in the side, so it was designed purposely to shatter if it had struck the opponent in the appropriate way. And that little device on the breastplate is to hold this thing, to lock it in, to keep it from sliding backward on impact. This is a triple-barreled gun, which has seen the results of either action or abuse. Part of King Henry VIII. Perhaps it misfired. This armor is more interesting for its irony than for its armor. It was the king's champion bronze armor of George I, and the King's Champion, as I'm sure part of the pomp and circumstance and delusion, rode into the hall and challenged anyone who questioned the right of authority to the throne and power to the throne of George I. I suspect there were many in that room that would gladly have taken up the gauntlet had not their life been forfeit afterward. Presumably an example of what the Armory gunpowder looked like when it was stored. (1796) light cavalry trooper's sword. 1796 heavy cavalry trooper's sword. Here's the hanging. You climbed a ladder to a height sufficient enough to break your neck. And then presumably you were hacked into pieces, quartered. And then boiled in pieces rendered non-existent. This was the easiest part of what was going to happen to you. Apparently a typical Armory storage scheme. Certainly one of their benefits was to keep your adversary as far away from you as you could. These are the original storage devices. I don't know. It looks rather elegant. Apparently the columns were intentionally ornate and historically ornate. John Harris of Eton in Buckinghamshire was the leading designer of arms displays in England during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. This was called the Spanish Morning Star. A walking staff. And this is the Spanish Roncoeur. What a deadly looking device that is. And I saw others this morning that were even more deadly, of a similar design with more cutting blades. This was cannon shot designed to either rip through a ship or lay waste to the humans on the decks. And of course, some kind of handcuff or arm device. This is the historical thumb screws. Probably made for the execution of the Spanish Jacobite Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, in 1747, the last beheading on Tower Hill. What a gruesome exhibition. What happened to the body after the head was removed? Equally gruesome question. This is the Scavenger's Daughter, or the Spanish cravats, as they are called. Engines of torture made of iron put on board to lock the fleet arms and heads of English heretics together. This is a multiple-barreled mortar. Some cannonball. I wonder how much those weigh. These are fused parts as a result of the fire. And some are artifacts that were created out of those things, such as the canvas.
Das ist ja unwichtig. Für die.
These are cisterns that held water for the king and whomever. The benefit of getting here early is that I avoided all of that line, walked in, very few people there, went through once and had the luxury of immediately walking back through at my leisure. That's Traitors Gate, where the condemned were brought through from the river. And a quaint little patio garden for some caretaker of some sort here. This is Cold Harbor Gate. At least it's signed that way. What it was, presumably a gate, but it tied into this building, the White Tower, the original building. And then some remnants of this wall. I don't know any history about it. Don't know what those cages are either, where the ravens are. Interestingly, they warn you that the ravens can bite. This is the Crown Jewels building on the right, and the chapel on the left, and one of London's new icons, the egg, seen behind it. This is Traitors Gate, seen again from the outside. Inside the walls. And the Byward Tower. Notice in the background that church I'd observed earlier that alludes to the past but looks like it's modern and relatively new. Stopping down just a few more feet to give another view